Good evening. We have a very special treat for you tonight on Alternative Views because we are featuring again Dr. Helen Caldicott, but not the program you've seen a few times before, the interview which we did with her about 3 years ago. This is a speech she made, a demonstration of what nuclear power is like, what radiation does to the body, what nuclear war would be like, and the problems connected with nuclear power, nuclear energy in general. She's a dynamic person. I've never seen anybody be able to hold an audience. I saw her speak for an hour and a half at the University of Texas one night, and nobody moved. Everybody's riveted, and after it was over with, everybody just sat there stunned. Some people, tears rolling down their face. Most people just, and they didn't talk. They just left. Incredible woman. She's helped stop the nuclear race in Australia. She almost single-handedly stopped the French from testing their nuclear devices in the Pacific. She's quite a woman. We'll hear from her later on.
It's what the nuclear industry have called for years the melt through to China syndrome. And that's why the movie was called The China Syndrome. And when that happens, there'll be a huge steam explosion which will rupture the containment vessel and release the radiation inside. And there's as much radiation in these reactors as that released by 1,000 Hiroshima-type bombs. That's why the NRC officials were sweating on national television. They should have ordered evacuation because when you read the government documents, I've just written a paper on this, if there was a meltdown, it would totally and permanently devastate an area the size of Pennsylvania. But you have to keep it quiet. Remember, if you read the tapes, Henry, who's the head of the NRC, said, "Is there a law for freedom of the press? If there is, I'm against it." And all through the tapes, they were talking about how to keep this quiet. We won't evacuate yet because it would be bad publicity for the nuclear industry. What has to happen for the people of the world to wake up? These are huge death machines. It would be a catastrophe the likes of which the world has never seen before. Worse than Hiroshima. Worse.
Of Alternative Views. It's an address by Helen Caldicott, a pediatrician. She talks about the medical implications of nuclear power. Helen Caldicott is a medical doctor, a pediatrician in Boston. She was born in Australia and has been active in bringing the public attention to the health hazards of nuclear radiation. She's worked and traveled, playing a key role in getting the people of Australia to bring the French atmospheric nuclear testing to a stop. And she's also been working with the labor unions in Australia concerning the dangers of uranium mining. She's a mother of 3 children, is now a citizen of the United States, and since the making of this film, she quit her medical profession and has been working full-time on this situation regarding nuclear energy and nuclear war.
Uranium is the raw material for nuclear weapons and also for nuclear power, and it's an ore that's in the ground and it's mined, and like you put wood in a stove, you put uranium in a nuclear reactor. It's radioactive, and it decays to a whole series of daughter products over hundreds of thousands of years, and finally ends up as non-radioactive lead. You probably all know that. One of the daughters is radon gas. Now let's quickly go through the effects of radiation. There are 4 sorts of radiation. I'll go through this because I had to learn it as a physician, and I assume that you need to learn it too, but perhaps you already know it. There are X-rays, and we've all had an X-ray, I guess. Most people have been zapped by the medical profession. And then there are gamma rays, which are just like X-rays, non-particulate waves like light. They only hurt you when the technician says, breathe in, hold it, zap. That's the only time they can hurt you, and you notice at that time the technician disappears out of the room. Okay, now there are alpha rays and beta particles. Here's an atom. This is the Getty Oil trademark. That represents nuclear power. Okay, and here's a radioactive atom emitting alpha particles, which are composed of 2 protons and 2 neutrons, and it's a helium nucleus. It's very large. It has a large momentum, but it slows down rapidly because of its mass. So it only travels a distance of 40 microns before it stops. So it has to be inside the body to damage you, an alpha emitter, because if you hold, say, plutonium, which is an alpha emitter, on the hand, it doesn't penetrate the layers of dead cells in the epidermis before it damages a basal dermal cell, a living cell. So it has to be inside you. And these two materials, or alpha and beta emitting materials, are called internal emitters. They have to be inside your body to damage you. And all the stuff that's made in nuclear reactors are these things, internal emitters. And they also, many of them, emit alpha rays. And the material they were measuring around Harrisburg, they were measuring the gamma rays. They were measuring the gamma rays in their Geiger counters, but they weren't measuring the alpha and beta emissions, and that was very negligent of them, and I'm not sure if they are even yet. Beta radiation is when an electron is emitted from an unstable atom. It's smaller, less mutagenic or gene-changing, but still very dangerous and carcinogenic. Okay, now this radon gas here, which is emitted when uranium is mined, is an alpha emitter. Alpha emitters are among the most mutagenic agents that we know. Therefore, they're very carcinogenic. So the miner breathes in radon gas, which attaches to little particles of dust in the mine and inhales it. It lodges in the terminal bronchus, where for many years it just irradiates a very small volume of cells, as the alpha particle only travels 40 microns. The miner doesn't know he's inhaled the gas. He feels fine. He walks around for the latent period of carcinogenesis, which is any time from 15 to 50 years. That's why when the nuclear power industry says not one member of the public has died as a result of nuclear power, they don't know what they're talking about, or else they're lying, because it takes as long as that for the cancer to develop, and when the cancer does develop, it doesn't wear a little sign saying, my etiology was radon gas you inhaled when you were a uranium miner 20 years ago. You know that no cancer identifies its etiology. Okay, so in the past, 20 to 80% of men who've mined uranium have died of lung cancer. And that was bad news, because there was a senator called Senator Kerr. He was also in league with a man called Mr. McGee, and Kerr and McGee actually owned the plant where Karen Silkwood worked, and she got contaminated with plutonium. Well, they owned the uranium mines. It was known centuries ago that men mining uranium-bearing ores in Europe died of lung cancer. So they knew that they should ventilate the mines, but they actively lobbied against ventilation of the uranium mines because it would be expensive in the Senate, and they won. And now men are dying and will continue to die for years to come of radon-induced lung cancer. You must remember that most of the uranium mined in this country has been mined for the weapons program. Okay, the next step is the uranium is taken and it's crushed in a milling plant, the ore. Milling. The uranium per se is removed, and the radioactive daughters of the uranium are left lying on the ground in the form of tailings. And the tailings are very sandy, and they're sort of nice material to use for buildings. And they've been used for that. One of the daughters of uranium is thorium, which has a half-life of 80,000 years. That means if you have a pound of thorium in 80,000 years it decays, it doesn't change to a non-radioactive product, it decays to radon gas. As it decays, in 80,000 years you have half a pound, in 80,000 more years a quarter of a pound, and 80,000 more years an eighth. So it's around for a long time, and thorium decays directly to radon gas. Okay, now there are millions of acres of uranium tailings lying around this country on the ground. They're safe if they're buried deep in the ground. They've never been buried because it's too expensive. Industry produced them, moved on, nobody took responsibility for them. And in Grand Junction, Colorado, they built 5,000 houses out of them because they're nice sandy material, good for mixing with concrete. A pediatrician in '71 noticed a higher than normal incidence of babies being born with cleft lips and palates and other congenital anomalies. He started studying this problem, but the EPA cut off his funding, saying it wasn't a very important study. The houses now are being pulled down by the government at great expense. They're very radioactive, those houses, because as well as emitting radon, which is an alpha emitter, they also emit gamma radiation, so they're being continually X-rayed, those people. Salt Lake City is built around the uranium tailings dump of 1.7 million tons, and the Department of Energy say that people in Salt Lake City have double the risk of developing lung cancer than a non-exposed population. I don't think a good epidemiological study has been done of the people of Salt Lake City. One must remember still the latent period of carcinogenesis when one is doing such a study. 2 churches are made of uranium tailings in New Jersey, and I don't know what else. It's a big problem, and just recently Congress has passed a bill saying the government will be responsible for cleaning up the tailings. There are millions of acres of them. It's going to be a huge process. I don't know where they'll bury them, because if you just put 20 feet of earth on them, that's totally inadequate. When you think of the period of time that they remain radioactive, they have to be buried down deep mine shafts, right away from the environment. Okay, the next step is the uranium is enriched, because there are two isotopes in natural uranium, uranium-235 and 238. This is the non-fissionable one. This is what you make bombs and nuclear power plants out of, and it's only present in 0.7% in the natural ore. If it's enriched to 3%, that's what you put in a reactor. 20% or more, you make bombs out of it. And the bomb used on Hiroshima was a uranium bomb. Enrichment is exorbitantly energy consuming. It takes 2 nuclear power plants in France to run 1 uranium enrichment plant. Of all the energy produced in America, the electricity, nuclear power produces 12%, and of that 3% is used to enrich the uranium, so it's only a net 9% electricity production. But the president doesn't tell you that, does he? There's a huge industrial complex with acres and acres and acres of factories down in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, enriching uranium. It's been necessary for the weapons program, so it's all okay. In fact, nuclear reactors were first designed as bomb-producing factories, and that's what they still are. They make plutonium. And the collective guilt of the scientists was such after the war that they persuaded the government to become involved in the peaceful use of the atom, to use a nuclear reactor to utilize the waste heat which boils the water to make steam and make electricity. Hooray. Thank you. So they got involved. The utilities had to be convinced to get involved with nuclear power. It's very expensive. It's very technologically sophisticated, as we've all just learned. If you read the NRC transcripts of the tapes, in fact, nobody knows what they're doing when the crunch comes. And so therefore the nuclear industry is heavily subsidized, and it's really just a tangential offshoot of the weapons program. And until recently, the whole data and information from the industry was classified as secret under the umbrella of the Pentagon, or the Lawrence Livermore Labs, or whatever. And we couldn't get this stuff until the Freedom of Information Act was filed, and then we started to find out what was going on. And it's very concerning for the medical profession, for this is a medical problem. It's got nothing to do with jobs or economy or electricity. It's got to do with medicine, preventive medicine. Okay, the next step is the uranium is made into little pellets like you make aspirin tablets. I suppose many of you have seen China syndrome by now. Remember, Mike Douglas held a uranium pellet between his teeth and his tongue turned black, and Jane Fonda said, "You got polluted. You've become polluted." It's made into little pellets, and it's packed into a sort of curtain rod, a long rod, which is 1/2 inch wide and 12 feet long. And those rods are taken, they're called fuel rods, and they're put in a reactor like this. And they're put in the reactor core, which is here. And 100 tons of uranium fuel rods are packed into the reactor in close proximity. And it's all submerged in water, 100 tons. When you do that to uranium, enriched uranium, it reaches critical mass, and all the atoms start breaking apart spontaneously. Neutrons are emitted, they hit other atoms, they break apart in a very random fashion. And as they break, they form 200 new elements, which are fission products and fission byproducts. And they're all the elements that are made when you blow up a bomb. They're all the same as fallout, all exactly the same. And that's nuclear garbage. Nuclear sewage, nobody wants it, nobody needs it, and nobody knows what to do with it, and it is extremely carcinogenic. Okay, now, what happens is that incredible heat is produced during this reaction, which boils the water. The steam is taken off, which turns the turbine, which makes electricity. So that's all a nuclear power plant does. It boils water. It's like cutting a pound of butter with an electrical saw. It sort of seems unnecessary because it's a very sophisticated technology. Okay, now what happened at Harrisburg? Well, if the water level falls to below the level of the top of the rods, And you remember there was a big hydrogen gas bubble sitting up here. I guess the thing goes up here. And the gas bubble was forcing the water out of the reactor. What happens is that the rods are so hot that they will spontaneously melt, and a big globule of 100 tons of uranium will melt its way through the bottom of the reactor a quarter of a mile into the earth. And that's what the nuclear industry have called for years the melt through to China syndrome. And that's why the movie was called the China syndrome. And when that happens, there'll be a huge steam explosion which will rupture the containment vessel and release the radiation inside. And there's as much radiation in these reactors as that released by 1,000 Hiroshima-type bombs. That's why the NRC officials were sweating on national television. They should have ordered evacuation, because when you read the government documents, I've just written a paper on this, if there was a meltdown, it would totally and permanently devastate an area the size of Pennsylvania. And it's funny that that reactor happened to be in Pennsylvania. Now, 20% of the times the winds blow from the southwest towards New York and Boston. And the radioactive cloud could well have blown up there. And 80% of the time they actually blow towards Washington, D.C., where the NRC live. So that's why they were sweating. But what they didn't tell us is what would happen if it melted down. And I'm not quite sure why they didn't tell us this, but in all their documents it says over 3,000 people would die within 2 to 6 weeks of acute radiation illness. That means the actively dividing cells of the body are killed, the hair drops out, the gut sloughs off and ulcerates, so you have vomiting and diarrhea, and as the platelets and white blood cells are killed, you die of bleeding or infection. And that would be happening right now, depending on the way the wind blew, to populations of people in the United States of America. Hundreds of thousands of males would be rendered sterile from their testicles being irradiated. Hundreds of thousands of women would be rendered sterile too. They would stop menstruating, many permanently. Thousands of people would develop acute respiratory insufficiency because the radiation would have damaged their lungs and they'd get pulmonary fibrosis. Babies in utero, thousands would be born with microcephaly, small heads, as the brain, the neurons are very sensitive to radiation, the developing neurons. That happened in Hiroshima. Thousands more would be born as cretins, as the radioactive iodine intake by the mother concentrated in the fetal thyroid and ablated the thyroid gland. And the thyroid is very necessary for normal neurological development, so those cretins would be grossly retarded. There'd be a very high incidence of spontaneous abortion. 5 years later, there would be an epidemic of leukemia, which increased 30 times in Hiroshima. And 15 years later, solid cancers would start appearing in every organ, like there'd be 28,800 thyroid nodules and cancers. And I can't remember how many cancers of other organs, but it's in the hundreds of thousands. So why weren't we told? It's in every government document. They all know about it. That's why they were sweating. But you have to keep it quiet. Remember, if you read the tapes, Henry, who's the head of the NRC, said, "Is there a law for freedom of the press? If there is, I'm against it." And all through the tapes, they were talking about how to keep this quiet. We won't evacuate yet because it would be bad publicity for the nuclear industry. What has to happen for the people of the world to wake up? These are huge death machines. It would be a catastrophe the likes of which the world has never seen before, worse than Hiroshima, worse. No doctor is prepared to look after this situation. None of the hospitals are prepared. I wouldn't know how to handle a contaminated patient. None of us are trained. Evacuation plans are not even in effect. They're totally inadequate. How do you evacuate New York? When the wind's blowing towards New York at 50 miles an hour and there's a meltdown, the cloud takes 5 hours to get to New York. How do you evacuate New York? How do you evacuate Boston? What a cheek those people have got. Not to tell us what it would mean. Who do they think they are? And they say, oh, coal's more dangerous. What do they mean, coal's more dangerous? It produces a bit of asthma, a bit of respiratory disease. We are talking about a catastrophe of magnitude the world's never seen before. And it almost happened. By the grace of God, it didn't. And the reactor still has not reached cold shutdown, which means apparently there still is a chance that there could be a meltdown. Huh? So Carter took his wife, called Rosalind, into the reactor, into the control room just after, well, when they were still scared the hydrogen bubble might explode. And she really smiled a nice smile. Just a few hours before, the operators were told they could take their gas masks off because the radiation levels had dropped to levels where it was fairly okay. What's Carter doing in there with his wife? Smiling and reassuring everyone? I wouldn't take my wife in there if I had a wife. Either the man's ignorant, or he doesn't give a damn. Or he represents the oil companies because they own the nuclear power plants and they own the uranium. Hey? Why are we all mad with the oil companies? They all own this stuff. They want to own the sun too. That's why we're not into solar power, because they can't. Someone said if they could put a blanket around the earth and sell holes in it, they would have been into solar power years ago. So that's where we are, folks. And it's all tied up with the Pentagon, because the nuclear reactors make plutonium. Now, these 200 elements, every year they remove about a third of the spent fuel rods because they're very radioactive. And they become inefficient with the fission products sort of mounting up inside them. And in the past, and the military is still doing this, they're taken to a reprocessing plant where they put in a big vat of nitric acid and they're dissolved, like that. And from that is removed the waste uranium and plutonium, and all the rest of the garbage is left in here. And it's presently stored in stainless steel tanks all around this country, which have a life of 50 years or less, and they're leaking right now. In Hanford, Washington, just next to the Columbia River, they lost 430,000 gallons of high-level waste. That stuff is so radioactive you daren't go near it or it'll kill you. They've lost it near the Savannah River. There's a huge vat of radioactive waste at Lake Erie, West Valley, containing 600,000 gallons. They say there's not enough water in all the oceans of the sea to dilute it to safe levels. It's starting to leak right now. Nobody knows what to do with it. They've just held congressional hearings, and the report was it's a gargantuan problem, time is the essence, and nobody knows what to do with it. I went to see the congressman who owns the West Valley situation, and as I walked in the office, a pediatrician, he said, now just fantasize for a minute. Can you tell me what you would do with that waste? And had heard from the top experts throughout the country. A recent report by geologists for the EPA says that this waste has to be stored isolated for 1 million years. And the longest they can store it by present methods of technology is 10 years. And Christ lived 2,000 years ago. And all the elements are the ones you're familiar with, or some of them. Many you're not, because they haven't even been researched in the food chain. But the strontium-90, with a half-life of 28 years, so it's poisonous for 600 years. Strontium-90 concentrates in the grass, and then it concentrates in the milk, and it concentrates highest in human breast milk. Very radioactive. If a baby drinks a strontium-90 in its milk, it concentrates in the bone because the bone thinks it's calcium. Where it just irradiates a few cells for many years, it's very carcinogenic. It causes the sort of bone cancer that Teddy Kennedy's son had. Remember, he had his leg amputated. Also causes leukemia. Radioactive iodine has a half-life of 8 days. Very carcinogenic, concentrates in grass and then in milk, and it locates in the thyroid gland where it irradiates the thyroid cells for many years and can cause thyroid cancer. We know that because Americans tested a bomb in the Pacific and the wind went the wrong way, and a whole lot of beautiful native people living on an island called Rongelap got a huge fallout, and there have been 28 cases of thyroid tumours in that population, and 3 cretins were born. It's a very small population of several hundred people. Well, I called Harrisburg the other day and I spoke to the NRC and I said, what's happening? Are you measuring any radioactive? First, how much did you let out? What did you let out? Well, they don't know. Over the first 48 hours, they let out a lot. They apparently vented the primary cooling system, and over 60% of the rods have melted and broken the cladding, letting the fission products and the actinides mix with the water, and apparently they vented that steam, and you never, ever vent primary coolant. And that happened. Commonwealth Edison did it before the NRC got in the act. The NRC were notified for 56 hours. They didn't get into the act. They don't know what they've let out. Now, they're still venting radioactive iodine now, a lot of it. They've vented xenon and krypton. They said that's okay, they're noble gases. They don't combine in the body. Krypton happens to be 10 times more soluble in fat than water. It tends to locate in the abdominal fat pad and upper thighs, and it's a very high energy gamma emitter where it can irradiate the testicles and ovaries. They don't talk about that. So I said, well, you know, is there any iodine around? They said, oh, it's okay, we're measuring the milk. We can't find any in the milk. And I said, well, what are you feeding the cows on? They said, well, we're hand feeding them. I said, what? You what? They said, we're hand feeding them with stored food. And I said, what are you measuring the milk for? Oh, they said, you always measure the milk. The cows aren't even eating the grass. And anyway, in New England, the grass is only just starting to come up now because it's winter over there. The cows are about to be put out to pasture, and they're measuring the milk. Now, how naive and stupid and foolish and ignorant are they? The man I spoke to was a PR agent for the NRC. He was in AP a few years ago. He hastened to reassure me, and he said it was okay because there was no iodine around. Iodine has the half-life, I said, of 8 days. It's poisonous for several weeks, but almost surely the strontium-90 there and cesium, and they're poisonous for 600 years. Hershey's chocolates are 35 miles away. It's a very rich dairying industry. And they say, well, it's all right, they're changing the milk into powdered form so the radioactive iodine can decay to safe levels. But what about the strontium-90 and the cesium and all the other stuff? Okay, now, what am I up to? This plutonium is taken out because that's what's used for atomic bombs, and plutonium is an alpha emitter, and it didn't exist before we fissioned uranium. It's a man-made element, and it's appropriately named after Pluto, the god of the underworld. It is so carcinogenic that a millionth of a gram, just a minute amount, if you inhale it, will almost certainly induce cancer, lung cancer. Now, it may be nanogram quantities which are carcinogenic, 10 to the minus 9 grams. And I say to a lay audience, if you take a pound of it, you can't do this, but hypothetically, if you could take a pound and put a little piece in every person's lung on Earth, 1 pound would be sufficient to kill every human being on Earth. And each reactor makes 500 pounds of it every year, and it only takes 10 pounds to make an atomic bomb. And you all know now an average engineering student can design and make a bomb with materials bought at the local hardware store. All he needs is a lump of plutonium the size of a grapefruit. And you can hold it in your hand, as I said. It's okay, as long as you don't get it in your body. It happens to have a half-life of 24,400 years. So it's poisonous for 500,000 years. So if I die of lung cancer induced by plutonium and I'm cremated, my smoke goes out the chimney with the plutonium, conceivably to be breathed into somebody else's lung. The body thinks plutonium is iron, so it's combined with transferrin, the iron-transporting protein. It's stored in the liver, where it causes liver cancer. It crosses the placenta, where it's teratogenic and can damage the developing embryo like thalidomide did. Only plutonium, you see, is thalidomide forever because it's not biodegradable. And it concentrates in the testicles and ovaries where it can damage the genes in the eggs and sperm to increase the incidence of genetic disease. There are 2,000 genetic diseases described. I treat the commonest one, cystic fibrosis, and all my patients die under the age of 30. But the geneticists say we don't have to worry about seeing the effects of genetic disease over 50 or 100 or 200 human generations because plutonium is so carcinogenic that we'll probably die of malignancy, most of us, before that time. It's said that if only 0.01% of the plutonium handled to the year 2000 by the industry and the Pentagon leaks, it could cause 25 million cases of cancer. Sounds like science fiction, doesn't it? I wish it was. Which leads me on to the next thing. Plutonium is what you make bombs out of. And America makes 3 to 4 new bombs every day because there aren't enough. America now has enough nuclear weapons to overkill every Russian person, and that's a Pentagon term, overkill. That means you kill them and they stand up again, and you kill them and they stand up again. Overkill them 40 times. 40, just 40. And Russia has enough to overkill every American 20 times. That Trident submarine that Rosalind Carter helped launch the other day, and she put her initials on the keel of the Trident submarine, has enough nuclear weapons to ablate every major city in the Northern Hemisphere, and America is building 27 Trident submarines, because one isn't enough. Nuclear war, those rockets go from one country to another and they take half an hour to get there. They land accurately on target. Meanwhile, the opposing satellite has picked the attack up and the button's been pressed. Nuclear war would only take a couple of hours to totally complete. Every single town in America with a population of 25,000 people or more right now is targeted with a nuclear weapon. And Leonid Brezhnev is a sick man. He's been treated with steroids. And you all know that steroids can occasionally induce acute psychosis. In fact, the man in charge of the button in this country a few years ago was not what any psychiatrist would actually term psychiatrically stable. In fact, Nixon had his black box removed from him about 6 weeks before he resigned. Jimmy Carter seems a fairly sane guy on the surface, but you know, he could develop a frontal lobe tumour. And we've seen people with frontal lobe tumours start doing crazy things. You know, things can happen to people who have a cerebral tumour just slowly and insidiously. And then suddenly you wake up and you do a CAT scan and there's a tumour. I mean, we're in the hands of fallible human beings, aren't we? When I wrote my book called Nuclear Madness, I asked the Pentagon people, what would happen if all the weapons went off? And do you know what? They're not exactly sure. There are two scenarios: that the nitrous oxide release would destroy much of the ozone layer, thereby letting in the background radiation from the sun in massive proportions. The heat release would melt much of the polar ice caps, and the huge fallout might destroy every organism on Earth. Maybe the cockroaches might survive. They're 400,000 times more radio resistant than human beings. Or else maybe some people might survive in rural areas. Now, if you're in a shelter, you won't survive, because a 20 megaton bomb produces a firestorm of 3,000 square miles. If you're in a shelter, you'll asphyxiate. That's what happened in Dresden during the firestorms. If you're lucky enough to be in a rural area, you'll have half an hour's notice to get to a shelter if there is one. Now, you can't come out for 2 weeks or you'll die of acute radiation illness from the incredible radiation. When you come out, it's quite possible there'll be no friends or relatives left. There'll be no doctors, no drugs or hospital beds, because we're all targeted. Disease will be rife as there are millions of dead bodies, and viruses and bacteria mutate to become more virulent, and our immune mechanism is depleted and we become more sensitive to infection. You can't eat the food if there is any. The water will be radioactive. You'll have to live underground to escape much of the radiation and grow plants with very shallow root systems that don't absorb the radioactive elements so much. And you can imagine the Earth, you might live for 5 years before you get leukemia, or 15 years before you get a cancer. And you just let your imagination go. You can imagine the Earth being inhabited by bands of roving mutant humanoids, generations hence, unrecognizable as human beings. What are the chances of this happening? Well, a few years ago, the early warning system on the Arctic Circle noticed some Russian missiles coming. So the American planes took off with their nuclear weapons for the attack. They passed 2 checkpoints. They almost reached failsafe when the Russian missiles disappeared from the screen. They discovered later they were a flock of geese. That happened twice, and on another occasion it was a shower of meteorites. There are 2 men in the Titan missile silos who live underground like moles. They both have to pull a lever simultaneously to initiate a nuclear war. The levers are 10 feet apart. They've had psychological testing by the Pentagon, and they're called by the Pentagon the sanest men in America. They've worked it out, though. If you tie a string to the other lever and you put a spoon in the string, it's called the spoon and string trick. If you do that and twist the spoon, you can get both levers down at once by one man. They both have a pistol to shoot the other if one shows abnormal behavior. And over the past few years, by official Army records, 30 of them have been certified psychotic. Men who are inebriated with alcohol service nuclear weapons on Honolulu. Honolulu has 2 industries, tourism and nuclear weapons. There are over 3,000 hydrogen bombs stored 2 miles from the international airport if you're flying in there next time, just to the left of the glide path. And they're mixed with conventional explosives. If a jumbo jet dropped on them, it could well initiate a nuclear explosion. On Honolulu, I was there recently, inside a mountain, is the command post for the Pacific. And it controls literally 70% of the Earth's population. It's named after a man called H.M. Smith, whose nickname in the Army was Mad Dog. On the top of that command post, there is a cross, the largest cross of Christ in the whole of the Pacific Islands, which is lit at night, was put there to remind the men who have their fingers on the button of their moral responsibility. I have never seen a cross used so ineptly. What are our chances? Well, some of the greatest brains at Harvard and MIT now predict our chances of survival to the year 2000 at being less than 40%. There are now 35 countries with nuclear weapons capabilities because this country sold them nuclear reactors. Carter's answer to countries making their own bombs from their nuclear waste is to bring the whole of the free world's spent fuel back to America and store it in America, so America will be the repository for the free world's nuclear waste. America doesn't know what to do with its own waste. The Department of Energy have just issued a report to the President saying, we don't know what to do with our waste after they've held nationwide hearings. I testified there, they don't. They say, but you trust us because we're scientists. We'll find the answer. That's like me saying to a patient, you've got a pancreatic carcinoma, your prognosis is 6 months, but have faith in me. I'm a good doctor, I might find the cure in 50 years, 30 years. It's really insane. Now let's look at it clearly. Einstein said the splitting of the atom changed everything save man's mode of thinking, and thus we drift towards unparalleled catastrophe. 46 cents out of every federal tax dollar we pay is used by the military-industrial complex in death. By paying our federal taxes, we are all sipping at the Pentagon Kool-Aid vat. We are now the curators of all life on Earth. We hold it in the palm of our hand, and with the press of the button, we can destroy it, and we may be the only life in the universe. We are fantastic creatures, I think, capable of such great love, sensitivity, relationships, art, music, literature, creativity. Yet we can wipe it all out. But I think the power for love and good is really stronger than the power for evil if it's mobilized. For the first time, war is obsolete. Even conventional war is out now because you just need to drop a blockbuster on one of those reactors and release the radiation inside. The enemy doesn't need nuclear weapons anymore to commit genetic genocide of this population, or in Russia. This is a medical issue. The ultimate in preventive medicine is to eliminate nuclear power and nuclear weapons. It also is a religious issue. Are we not charged by God to continue evolution and life on Earth? We must not be passive any longer. We must have a total commitment to stop this insanity. Nothing else matters. Doesn't matter if you immunize your kids, give them good nutrition, write a good research paper, have a good relationship, if our children aren't going to grow up. This is the UN International Year of the Child. This is the ultimate in prophylactic pediatrics. Thank you.
We'll have some more news stories from alternative sources in just a few seconds, but first we'd like to show you the addresses of the distributors of the videotape and the film of the presentation you've just seen by Helen Caldicott. Now for the remaining news stories. We start with a commentary from Craig's Corner.
I'd really like to hear a bit more about the radiation leakage at the Savannah River nuclear plant. They make all of our weapons-grade plutonium there, you might realize. And as you may have heard, people from 7 South Carolina towns ringing the plant have contracted a rare blood disease associated with exposure to radiation. A spokesman for the Energy Department said that they had no knowledge of these reported cases, but they had nothing to do with the plant, of course. Some 700,000 people live within 60 miles of the Savannah site, which is owned by, guess who? The Energy Department, and run by our big buddy DuPont. Now this could be the start of something big. Y'all stay tuned. The Savannah plant surely has state-of-the-art radiation shielding to protect surrounding citizens. Are we now to understand that all of our safety precautions at all of our nukes aren't quite as adequate as we thought? Should we maybe rethink or recalculate this whole thing? I'm just curious. I'm also curious about these Love Canal home sites that the Environmental Protection Agency says are once again inhabitable. Did all that poison really just up and go away? You see, lately I've gotten this funny way of looking at government agencies. I don't trust them. Isn't that terrible? But I do think we could resolve this whole matter of agency credibility with one easy step. The government, that's we the people, owns the land in Love Canal, right? Well, let's throw up a few prefabs there and outfit them with window units, heaters, and water coolers and the like. Then we can move Ann Gorsuch and the EPA to their new Love Canal headquarters. They can live in the abandoned houses there, of course. And if they're all still healthy after a couple of years, we'll know it's safe to build condos there and put them on the market. In Savannah, until we get Quonset huts set up, the Energy Department can stay at the nearest Holiday Inn. There's an old saying in the military, a good leader won't ask a man to do anything that he wouldn't do himself. Now, I can get behind that. As a matter of fact, for my own spiritual well-being, this is definitely one of those times that I'd say, you first, fearless leader.
That's Alternative Views for this time. We appreciate you joining us. We have some people to thank for Alternative Views. People who were in our crew. Our camera person was Eric Eubank. Our audio man was Kevin L. West. And of course, Austin Community Television, ACTV, provided the editing equipment. Alternative Views is a presentation of the Alternative Information Network, P.O. Box 7279, Austin, Texas, 78713. People say they would like to write us, but we don't leave this little address here on long enough for them to write it down. So we're going to leave it on for a bit. So if you have pencil and paper, you can jot it down and drop us a line. We'd be more than happy to hear from you. Alternative Information Network, P.O. Box 7279, Austin, Texas, 78713. Goodbye.